Hello everybody, welcome back to some more managing people and organizations. We're in week 4 now, and today's lecture, people, is going to be a little bit more conceptual and theoretical, because this is a really important foundation for you to be better managers and to make better decisions. So what are we going to talk about today? Today we will have a chat about this idea of information technology and how information technology is actually changing the workplace. So this is really important. It's not just what it is, but what it actually does. We want to look at the current directions and information systems that exist, and now then to look at how information is actually used for decision making. And that brings us to the key component here of how managers make decisions, and also we're looking at finally the idea of knowledge management and organizational learning. To get back into this, people, I want to recap a little bit here. We've talked about information technology in a new workplace in the past, and we talked about this idea of a knowledge worker. A knowledge worker is somebody who can transform knowledge or information into a product or service. Often engineering innovations is in place here, or if you work in IT, when you analyze data, you gain certain outputs that create certain actions. That's a knowledge worker, people. And then, of course, that the intellectual capital component here is the collective brain power of all these knowledge workers in your organization. This is really, really important to understand. The knowledge that people generate and that they share, that sort of creates that intellectual capital in an organization that is then used to create value. Now, looking at this into a little bit more detail, this idea of utilizing intellectual capital, people, is to make sure that information and the way it flows is actually used by people in organizations. There is no point if people know something and it isn't shared. Sometimes you have these ideas, oh, person A is an expert in a field. And I go, can I talk to person A? And they say, no, you can't. I was like, okay, great. So that person A is an expert is not helpful for me. The knowledge is only as good, people, as people utilize and use it and can access it. And this is where computer competency starts to become really important, because a computer is a tool. It's a tool that needs to be used to take advantage of it personally and professionally. So when you look at in CVs, job advertisements that say you need to understand Microsoft Office, Word, PowerPoint, Excel, they don't talk about necessarily writing a document, creating a presentation. They talk about, can you make this software useful for yourself, for the tasks that are at hand? That is slightly different, and that's what you have to bring, and that's why they ask these kind of points. Looking at the idea of information competency now, people, this is something different. Again, utilizing computers and information to locate, retrieve, evaluate, organize, and analyze information to make certain decisions. And in your assignments, we ask nothing different. We will ask you exactly to do research, to locate, to retrieve, to evaluate that research, to construct arguments from that research. That is no different. So that these assignments, people, that we give you actually do test and hone your information competency. 1 second, I've got my trusty water with me. A quick sip. So as you can see, people, information and utilizing it, two different things. Let's talk about information technology then and the new workplace. So information technology is not the computer that's in front of you. By definition, information technology is the combination of what we have: computer hardware, software, networks, databases, to support our use of information, which will help us to make decisions. And people, these information technology landscapes are rapidly challenging. If you look at an interesting example at the next page, we all started in the 1950s and 40s with the advent of the telephone, organizations having telephones. Later on, when the mobile phone came out, when organizations like Philips still made Vodafones and Motorola, but they're having a comeback now, it changed the workplace. Now smartphones as well. A lot of apps, a lot of workplace processes are geared solely for smartphones now. The idea of email, the idea of personal computers, and as you can see also this idea of using multiple screens at the same time. These are technologies that become useful for us. It is unthinkable today to have one monitor in an office, at least 2, if not 3. So our information needs and our information drive have become so big that we need more outputs on average 2 or 3 monitors. That is a big change. And I also put the AI component there because AI is becoming increasingly a part of organizations, this sort of autonomous decision making by a computer through the interpretation of data and decision making by machines. Now that is really something interesting, and you will find in your workplace when you leave universities that you will start working increasingly with artificial intelligences and agents, so to speak, which are not humans. This is very interesting, but that doesn't mean all is good. We must be careful also. Some other developments, of course, people have been instant messaging. I know we had this since the 1990s with MSN, which some of you may remember, but the instant messaging component is a huge development, especially in workplace organizations with new Microsoft Teams, for example, which is basically a bit of recycled MSN and added functionality to it. But it's really important to quickly be able to share with colleagues data, short messages, you name it. Also, this peer-to-peer file sharing that is increasingly used to exchange large amounts of information, which is fantastic. But at the same time, people, we must be careful. These technological developments don't just create good things in workers. A lot of times, people, especially young generations, there's this fear of missing out. You sit together in a restaurant, 6 people, and you're all on your phones. Or you talk to your partner at a dinner, and all of a sudden phone rings and you have to be there. Well, is this more important, or is your partner's dinner more important? This is the question, people. And a lot of times we don't make these decisions because we're so afraid we're missing something. Because we're so afraid if we don't see it now, something might be going on. It's almost like a paranoia, people. And this is not because we are geared this way, or we have a mental disorder or something like that. It is really just about of how information flows, how fast connected we are. It creates sometimes these certain anxieties. Also, people, workplace cyberbullying through all this accessed communication as well as online harassment is still big issues in the workplace, people. And it's important as an organization, as a manager, you realize the use and misuse of technology. So also be careful what technology you actually want to implement and which technology you don't. But let's talk about how this information technology changes business. This idea of electronic commerce or e-commerce has really started coming about. And certain organizations like eBay, like Alibaba, people, they are purely in the e-commerce world, selling and buying something online. eBay doesn't own anything. They just provide the platform for other people to do so, to engage in electronic commerce, to put a product up on eBay for other people to sell it, you name it. Then it's gone a step further also, this idea of business to consumer e-commerce straight away. When a company sells to you online, Dell was really one of the first who did that you can buy a laptop online in the early 2000s, and Amazon buying books first of all. So this was really, really interesting, and how this all has developed now. We can pretty much buy anything online. But at the same time, people, business to consumer is one of those components, but also business to business. Marketing, raw materials, our supply chain, our subcomponents that we need, our markets, people, our other business markets, that is also handled increasingly on an e-commerce level. And that is why certain things like the coronavirus affects us so much, because of this interdependency on the internet and otherwise, people. So it's not just business to consumer. A lot of this runs business to business. But then you might say, well, Stan, this is really interesting, and I always wanted to know how these organizations develop an e-commerce business. And this is a very interesting question, people, and also something for you conceptually to think about. And it's not just, oh, Stan, I want to develop my own e-commerce business, but as a manager, it's perhaps very important to understand where you guys are actually standing with your organization that you work in. So looking at the stages of development in e-commerce business is gonna be very interesting. This idea of an online identity, later on a web presence. Do you have online advertising, product information? Also e-commerce. Does websites allow to order products? You name it. Customer relationship management, these bots that come up, hello, I can speak to you and answer your question. And later on, of course, a service application model that you can get straight away your services that you need from this side. Very interesting, people, in a sense that where ECU, for example, stands. And ECU, I say they stand between point 2 and point 3 because they have established a web presence, online advertising, product information. But at the same time, people, it has also become, for staff and students, you get access to supplementary software that is greatly reduced in price. So that starts to already trickle into the e-commerce sector. So it's nowhere near clear cut, people. So look at your organizations, in which step of e-commerce do they actually stand? And it's a nice thing to simply be aware of. And where do you want to go with that? Do you want to develop it? Are you happy with where you're standing? That information is extremely valuable as a manager to be aware of where you stand and if you want to go somewhere, if you don't want to go anywhere with it. Now, looking at information and information systems, people, the most important thing is data. You want to make decisions, people, you need data. People say, well, gut feeling, yeah. No, you need quantifiable, measured values, people. Observations, statistical counts, you name it, to make decisions. And there's different types of data: cultural data, scientific data, financial data, statistics, of course. How do you think the weather forecast is shown to us? They don't roll a dice and say, hey, tomorrow, I think chance cloudy with some thunderstorms, or tomorrow is sunny, let's roll the dice. The weather forecast is predicted based on statistics, not based on facts. Well, statistics can become facts, but it's the best guess we can make. Also, transport statistics, geographical statistics, they all help us in making decisions. But we must be careful, people, because in today's day and age, unfortunately, you are flooded with a lot of data, quantifiable values. But are they useful? That is the question, people. As a manager, you really have to understand what is useful information: timeliness, the quality, completeness, the relevance, and the understandability, people. Now, while I take a sip of my trusty water, I want to know, which one do you think is the most important of those 5? Well, I'll give you a couple of seconds. Now let's see what you thought. The correct answer here, in my opinion, and this is an opinion based, is relevance, people. Because if the information is not appropriate, it can't be useful. It doesn't matter if it's timely, it doesn't matter the quality, it doesn't matter if it's complete or you understand it. If it's not relevant to you, it's useless. The aligned component, the information needs to be useful to what you want or to your situation. Otherwise, it really doesn't help you, people. Very, very important. The others, of course, matter. You might say, well, Stan, why is relevance then in there? But again, that's what the textbook says, these 5 points. But in the real world, you will understand that relevance is the most important. If the information is not aligned, if it's not useful for what you want, it is useless. You're wasting your time. That's the real world. But the others, of course, are also important. Completeness, you will never have full and complete information, only the most you can. Accuracy, reliable data, that's a very important factor. A lot of fake statistics, fake news, sometimes we call certain things as well. We have to actually verify our sources, double check what is their agenda, what is their perspective. So it's really harder to actually verify whether information is useful or not. And every organization needs information, and within the organization there's a different needs of information. Have a look, people. The first level managers, they need operational plans on objectives, short-term decisions, day-to-day business operations, people. The middle managers, on the other hand, they formulate operational plans and objectives to implement strategies. So they need broader data, so to speak. And of course, the top managed people, they only need broad overall pictures of information of how an organization runs. I will give you an example. One of my friends, he had to convince the board of directors that this is a real life scenario, to spend $300 million to buy one company. Do you know how long he had and how many slides in PowerPoint he was allowed to use to convince the board? He had exactly 5 minutes and 2 slides. So it's really important that the information you give to people there is relevant. It doesn't have to be complete, but it must be accurate and it must be understandable. So what consists of useful information, people, changes depending also on the organizational level. And of course, people, that information is gathered also from the external environment and is also disseminated to the external environment, people. So information needs is not just for the organization, but also, of course, for its variety of stakeholders. Now we're getting to the interesting part, people. Information and decision making. So we talked about informations, the quality and what it can be used for. Fantastic. But we haven't truly talked about the decision making component here. Because remember, managers I talked about in week 1, planning, organizing, leading and controlling, which we will go in the coming weeks in much more detail. But at the same time, remember, people, our biggest task as managers, we solve problems. That is mostly what we do. We understand what is and what should be the actual and the desired state of affairs, whatever, operations, targets, employees, you name it, and we take action to resolve this problem, or we take advantage of an opportunity that we see what could be and where we're at now. This is the job as a manager, people. So we always must keep one ear on the ground, for the sake of a better term, listening to news, listening to what's going on in the world and how this may or may not affect our organization. But to make it even more interesting, my friends, what is a decision? Because we always talk about decision making, making decisions. Fantastic, fantastic. But what is it? Well, I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about just what comes to mind for 2 seconds. We'll have a sip of water and then we'll continue. Everybody, a decision, by definition, is a choice that we make between alternative courses of actions. So a decision, at the end of the day, we have multiple alternatives and we're choosing one. That is what's called a decision. You might say, Stan, well, I knew that. Did you really? The alternative courses of action? Or did you know a decision is simply what you decide? There's a difference, people, and this is where it really matters to know the definitions. And of course, the information systems, this is what I've talked about in the past just now, that can help managers to gather data, turn them into useful information, and use that information, people, to make decisions that solve problems. This is basically the manager's supply chain, so to speak. And it can be really fantastic to see what you learn every day and make that information useful. That makes you become a better manager. And remember, in class, we talk about critical thinking. We reflect. That is a key component to making that information useful to making decisions. That's why in the tutorials we always talk about reflection and what do you think, bringing your personal experiences, your personal circumstances, backgrounds into play, because that will help you determine those kind of choices that you have to make that leads you to a final decision. But a decision is not just a decision, people. You have to be careful. Managerial decisions, people, they come in a few. Because some decisions you have to think about, others you don't, you sometimes say, right? True. Because some decisions are programmed. You apply solutions from past experience to a routine problem. If a student wants to change a class and the class has capacity, perfect, you write back, absolutely, you can change. You go to the system, you change the student's enrollment, finished. Programmed decision. If a car rental company is looking at renting out half their fleet the next day, they make sure beforehand that they double check if there's enough cars there, 10% contingency, you name it. These are all programmed decisions, people, day-to-day operations. Non-programmed decisions are interesting. There are specific solutions for specific problems, and the higher you go in an organization, people, the more you will find non-programmed decisions, the more you find that that's what we talked about. Remember, top managers, they have to lay out the field in which direction we're going, and that's new grounds. These are always non-programmed decisions, people. And we have to be careful with that. There is no instruction manual. You're basically writing the manual, always at the forefront, people. A crisis, on the other hand, is an unexpected problem that leads to disaster if it's not resolved quickly and appropriately. So if we don't make decisions, people, a crisis can really escalate. Unfortunately, I'm bringing this back up. This coronavirus is unfortunately a fantastic example of that. When a crisis has not been handled well, when non-programmed decisions were poor, when information was not sought, when decisions were not made, when delays occurred. This is what's happening now. And you might say, well, Stan, it's a bit more complicated than that, which is true. But at the same time, decision making is a key component of handling these crises, people. And remember, managers, if you're in a progressive organization, you plan ahead that crisis will occur and you plan ahead how to deal with them. So you have a few pre-programmed decisions, people. But of course, the conditions of decisions depends on the environment, if it's certain, if it's risky, or if it's uncertain. So you have to really feel which area does your decision fall into, people. And certain environments offer complete information, possible action alternatives, as well as consequences. You know exactly where you're going. A risk environment doesn't have all that information, which is most environments. We don't always have the information, but we have probability effects. We have likely outcomes. And what we are facing with the coronavirus, people, is an uncertain environment. It lacks so much information. We can't assign probabilities. We can't even pretend to predict likely outcomes of alternatives. And that's why the markets have crashed so much, because of that uncertainty. People are selling, they liquidate, they need that money in the bank to buy food for the next 2 or 3 weeks, you name it, on a mass scale. That is why the markets have crashed as well, because of the decisions made based on the environment. So unfortunately, it is a prime example now to show you how decisions are made under what circumstances, people. But of course, not to paint a black picture here of the world. In an organization, this is no different, people. And you most likely deal with risk environments. Sometimes certain true uncertainty would be one of the rarer cases there. So how do we approach decisions, people? We understand how to make decisions about managerial decisions, but that doesn't mean we know how to approach them yet. And that also depends on personality, people. We can have the problem avoiders that ignore information and they do not want to take decisions. They don't want to deal with the problem. Dangerous people. Very dangerous, because that will only escalate the problem. The problem solvers, they want to make the decisions and they want to solve problems. They're reactive. Okay, we go to that bridge when we get there, so to speak. When the problem arises, we deal with it. The problem seekers, they process information, constantly look for problems or opportunities, people. Those are the ones you want, the proactive ones, because it's better to think of 10 scenarios that you can dismiss instead of having one that you have to deal with. So the problem seekers, they solve problems before they are ever there. Now, managers can also look at systematic thinking or intuitive thinking. So, rational, analytically, you can solve problems, yes. But at the same time, sometimes as a manager, it's also really good to trust your gut instinct, your intuition. What does your intuition tell you that you can't fully explain? Don't dismiss those gut feelings as a manager. And the higher up you go, the more important this gut feeling will become, people. But remember, when you make decisions, a good compass is always your long-term goals. Remember that. Focus on long-term objectives. Be flexible dealing with short-term problems, but it is about long-term goals, people. Don't get swayed by meeting some short-term goals in sacrifice of possible long-term opportunities. Be a little careful with that. One of the other things I really want to talk about is a decision-making process. We've talked so much about decisions, and is there a way to talk and to make decisions, to learn to make decisions? And yes, there is. There's a 5-step process I quickly want to go through today with you. So as you can see, very conceptual lecture today, but if you practice and if you listen to some of these points, you really will become, in your personal lives, in your professional lives, you will become better decision makers, because you're simply more aware of what you have to think about. That is the real value from today's lesson. Most important, people, identify and define a problem. So you have to gather information, get information. This is really, really important. But don't get information too broadly or too narrowly. Focus on the symptom, focus on why the problem is there and not what has caused it. What has caused the causes in the first place? And be careful that you don't choose the wrong problem to deal with. So this is very important information. Your understanding of the problem and detailed understanding of the problem is as important as actually working then on the solution. Second, we start evaluating possible solutions. Here, people, you don't just sit down on your desk and think about it. What do I do? Involve as many people as possible. Maximize information. You also build commitment. You're involving people to solve problems together. You all put your heads together. No one says you have to do it alone. That is the value of teamwork as well in your assignments, that you can actually put your heads together, think about a structure, think about information. And once you have agreed, you can all go and start doing and working towards that one common decision or goal that you have agreed on. Of course, evaluating possible solutions, people, that requires a cost-benefit analysis, so to speak. You compare the costs and the benefit of each course of action, and every action has benefits, every action has costs. Just make sure that the benefits outweigh the cost. Always really, really important. After that, you make the decision. Remember, there's a few choices. A classical decision looks at decision making with complete information. An optimizing decision, we look at alternatives given the best solution to a problem, but also the behavioral decision looks at when we have very limited information, bounded rationality, so to speak. And a satisfying decision looks at a satisfactory alternative that comes to your attention. So you can make these choices different, and they all have their place because you don't always have complete information. You can't always choose the best solution. It's about satisfactory first. Sometimes you just really don't have any information, and you may have to make what we call a judgment call, people. These are the three approaches: classic, behavioral, and, as I said, judgmental heuristics. That means that you let your gut tell you what to do. Past experience sort of flow together. It depends, yeah? But those are really the rarest choices. Behavioral, classical do take precedence here. Last but not least, you implement the solution. The choice to implementation is different. This buys the commitment. This is the action, people. You must have the ability and willingness to implement the decision. Here you don't question the decision anymore. The choice is made. Don't second guess, people. The worst thing is when you implement and you second guess. Don't do that, because that comes after in stage 5. You evaluate the results, people. If the results are not achieved, you have to go back and make a new choice. But you can't do that unless you've made the choice and waited for the outcome. So second guessing here is really, really detrimental. Follow through, see the outcome. Make a decision. The worst thing is if you keep second guessing and you don't make a real decision. You don't commit to a real decision, people. I want to quickly talk about the behavioral influences on decision making as well, people. We can't always get all the information in. We can't always have all these things available on time, people. So what we use is what we call a heuristic. A heuristic means it's a mental shortcut. You make decisions that you, for example, made in the past. You look at your intuition, you look at your memory, and all that information that you've collected in your life to make a decision. That's a heuristic. It assesses the likelihood of something occurring based on similarity. Oh, I've seen similar before. It may be just like that, people. It's really, really important. It helps you create a starting point for a new decision, people. And it's really time saving, as well as it brings the human side out in decision making, which can be really, really important for an organization. If decisions are made purely on numbers, employees might get that feeling that's exactly what they are. The human side is really important to keep an organization human, to keep people committed, not compliant people. Really, really important. Decisions can be made as individuals or groups, people. Of course, group decisions and team decisions, you have great information, lots of information, different alternatives can be examined. You avoid tunnel vision. We have acceptance and understanding and member commitment, of course, but we must be careful. Those decisions take time, as well as social pressures, people. So this idea of groupthink comes into play here. When group pressure forces a consensus, just be careful with that. When there's pressure from other members, when there's an illusion of group morality, when there's a self-censorship, oh, we can't think this way. No, we can't. If others are negatively stereotyped, oh, you're from this place, what do you even have to say? These kind of things. That really does happen in real life, people. And that is why you have to be careful with things like that. Really, really be careful. So as you can see, there's a lot of things to consider in decision-making process. I'm not expecting you right now to be better decision makers. But maybe you have to listen to the lecture twice, but at the same time, it gives you some great points to consider, perhaps that you haven't considered when you make decisions. And it gives you a good framework to simply become better decision makers in your personal and in your professional lives. I practice decision making every day, and I take different accounts into play. You have no idea how much I talk to people about this unit. I want to bring this into play. I want to make a decision here. What do you think? I always ask that question. I always want a second and third opinion, because it helps me to eliminate any tunnel vision, any things I have missed, you name it, for your benefit. All this information and decision making, people, that needs to be managed, of course, people. And that is what we call knowledge management, through which how we use our intellectual capital for competitive advantage. This is what it is all about, people. Remember, competitive advantage, people. We create competitive advantage through knowledge, through intellectual assets, you name it, specialized processes, methods, trade secrets, property rights, you name it. Some of this is even explicit knowledge that can be coded and shared, but a lot of it resides within people, which is really, really hard to share. And that's what makes you such a sought after employee, according to what you know, because the transfer is really hard. And organizational learning is using that knowledge to better the organization as a whole. This is really, really important. It's about continuously changing and improving how an organization runs through the lessons of experienced people. And we can and we have to talk about mental models, this idea of setting aside old ways of thinking, being self-aware and open-minded, learning how the organization works, sharing the vision to understand and agree to a plan of action, as well as team learning, working together to accomplish a goal. And here, people, does it ring a bell? A lot of these things are dependent, of course, on your diversity in your organization, on your organizational culture, which you as a manager set. So as you can see, as a manager, you really have tremendous influence on an organization. And it's not because you are a manager, you've been put in that position, but the things you can create with people. And remember, if you are a good manager, including people in decisions, in being open, trusting people, not so much micromanaging everybody, and taking into account different points of views, perhaps different to your own, you realize you will do very little problem solving, and you will actually be more occupied moving the organization forward in new and interesting directions, instead of trying to clean up after yourself after every decision that you've made when there's resistance or problems as a result of it. So as I said, it can be a very, very interesting job that you do, a very interesting role that you fulfill, depending small business, large business, whichever country. But for that, it's really important to understand these fundamental principles, which we will apply practically in the tutorials. Next week, people, is going to be very interesting because we're going to talk about planning. Remember, I said planning is the investment, everything else is the cost. So next week, we're going to talk about planning. I really hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to discussing some of these points in the tutorial as my colleagues are. Of course, any questions and concerns, please feel free to write me. Thank you.